My name is Roger Hill, and we're here today at Sotheby's Auction House in New York City. And right now, we're filming some of the walls here in preparation for the upcoming Sotheby's comic book and art auction.
Excuse me, let's stop.
Okay. All right, and so what?
I'll tell you when to begin.
Oh, all right.
Everything going here.
Okay.
Okay, begin.
This general part of the display here for the Sotheby's auction is the EC art section. And there's a few pieces here which I kind of wanted to speak about because they're very important to the history of comics. And I thought maybe we'd start with this piece. Now these are the original art, actually drawn large size, twice up for the comic book. Later this would be photographed and reduced down to the size of the comic by the printer. And I thought maybe we'd start with this piece here since it kind of gives you an overview of some of the staff people that worked for EC Comics, including this fella here, this chubby fella, Bill Gaines. He was the publisher of EC. And you've also got Al Feldstein, who was an editor of the EC Comics line. And a few of these other supporting characters here, Al Williamson, Wally Wood, Reed Crandall, and Jack Davis, all part of the EC family that developed during the 50s and produced some incredible comic books. And anyway, this particular piece is a house ad drawn by Wally Wood, signed here, which was advertising their New Direction line of comics that were to begin around 1955. And so it is a unique piece in that it shows all these staff members, you know, and of course the comic it's advertising is piracy. And this came at a time right after EC had, and a lot of other comic publishers had fallen into a real problem area with comics distribution, and that is that it was a very turmoil time in the life of a comics publisher during the mid-50s because they were publishing horror comics and science fiction comics and crime comics, and EC, along with many other publishers, fell under public pressure to disband those titles, and they had to clean up their act is what it basically amounted to. And when they did, they went into producing these type of comics, pirates, you know, something a little bit more tame than horror and crime. And let's also say a few words about this story here. This story, titled Thunderjet, is by Alexander Toth. It was done for Frontline Combat. That's the title of the comic, in 1952. It is a story that takes place in Korea, and that comic came out during the Korean War, I believe. And so, anyway, it is considered Alex Toth's finest work in the comic books. It's his finest visual contribution to the comic books. And it'll probably do quite well on auction. Let's see. We have two stories by Jack Kaman. Kaman was a very prolific artist who had actually began working in the comics in the 1940s. And these stories were done in the early 50s for EC's crime titles. This lower story here, called Revulsion, is from one of EC's science fiction comic books. I believe it's Weird Fantasy was the title. And Jour Lando, who was a very talented artist who continues to work in the comics field today. And this is one of his earliest science fiction stories, and very nicely done. And let's take a look at, this of course is Stonewall Jackson, done by Jack Davis, who a lot of people will recognize that name. Prolific cartoonist in America. He's done TV guide covers, Time magazine covers, all fields of advertising, movie posters, record albums. He's done it all. And so he's a very talented artist, extremely accomplished. This story is by Wally Wood. Of course, this is The Desert Fox, based on Rommel, who was the great German general. And this story, along with Atom Bomb, which is also by Wally Wood, appeared in EC's War comics, which were edited by Harvey Kurtzman. He was his war comics today are considered the finest ever produced in comic books, period. Let's take a look at Time to Leave. This is a story from Incredible Science Fiction, which was one of EC's last comic science fiction titles that they put out. And it's a story by an artist by the name of Roy, middle initial G, Crinkle. He was a very talented artist who went on later to paint paperback covers in the 60s for the many paperbacks published by Ace Books for the Edgar Rice Burroughs series, Mars and Venus series. Crinkle became a very, very good painter, and he was an extremely talented artist, and this is the only story he did at EC, and it's probably going to do very well in the auction. Here's a story published in Weird Fantasy or Weird Science called A Mistake in Multiplication by Jour, Lando. This is unique in that it's Joe's first story for EC Comics. This is the one that really, his first story, and you can tell it because the man got so carried away with intricate detail on this story. He just did a fantastic job, and it shows. Although Orlando did always give his best to EC and always put in as much detail as he felt was necessary. He was just one of their finest artists. 0 Hour by Jack Cayman. Very nice science fiction story. Brainchild. This is by an artist named Al Williamson, who was very influenced by the works of Alex Raymond, who did the newspaper comic strip Flash Gordon during the 30s. And so that's a very nice job. Brainchild will no doubt sell in the auction. Now here's a story. Special emphasis on this one. You Rocket. It's by an artist named Wood, and he usually signed his signature in an old English type lettering. And this fellow, who I've had a personal interest in for many years, was just one of the most incredible science fiction artists that ever took pen to paper and worked in the comics. You can tell by it. This man could draw spaceships with a claustrophobic effect. You know what I mean? Everything is so packed into that panel that it doesn't leave much space for someone to breathe. But obviously it does, because there is a crew in this story, and it's. But Wally Wood, he had such great perspective on anything he designed and drew for the comics, and his lightness balanced against his dark blacks in there was always so well done. And notice how he also used this little zipatone right here. This is a shading screen that a lot of artists use for kind of a quick way to get a gray element into a black and white comic story, and which kind of softened the edge of it. Rather than just a stark black and white, they could soften it up just a little bit. And so anyway, You Rocket was one of the last sci-fi stories that EC published, but it was a very good one. And Wally Wood is considered just about the best talented man that ever drew science fiction. And right up there with him is this fella here, which is Al Williamson. And this story, titled Mad Journey, is really a beautiful, especially this here is the splash page. The first page of any comic book story is referred to as the splash page, and that's because it had a large splash panel, which kind of grabbed the reader's attention right away. And this story is unique in that a lot of the shading on this page is not done with the zip tone that we pointed out up here. The artist had another element that they would use, and it was called craft tint or chemical board. And what they would do is there were two chemicals which they would actually apply with a brush, which would bring out, once they applied the chemical on this specially treated paper, it would bring out a line pattern going one way, and there was another line pattern going the other direction. So by using that, by using either one or both chemicals, you could get two grades of shadows or shading. And so it worked very well up here for a lighter shading technique versus down here for the darker shadows that the artist tried to put in there. And over here he used some of it on this fella's face and on the little statue of the gal. And it just worked so well. And Williamson was certainly really good at what he did. And this story is special in that good friends Frank Frazetta and Roy G. Krinkle assisted Al with this story. And not too many people know it, but this also happens to be Al's first contribution to EC. That was his first job for him, and one of his finest. The next artist we're going to talk a little about is another one of my personal favorites. He was a horror artist, and we're talking about Reunion here. This is a story called Reunion by an artist. As you can see, it's signed G. Ingalls, and his first name was Graham. And he also did this story, Pickled Pints, and this story down here, For the Love of Death. And this was the Witch's Cauldron feature that appeared in an EC comic book titled The Haunt of Fear. Well, she also appeared in Tales from the Crypt and The Vault of Horror. But anyway, Ingalls was the most talented man as far as horror comics went. There's just nobody who has surpassed him. He's known for this. His reputation is just unparalleled in comics. And as you can see, Ingalls had a special knack of accomplishing a photographic legitimacy to images by using shadows of darkness and black in there. You know, it's amazing that he was able to do little things like this, a little silhouette, you know, and the shadows in the water here and what have you, because he would knock this out fairly quick with a brush. He wasn't a pen man. He was a brush man. Well, I take that back. I shouldn't say strictly a brush man, because he also used some pen work in here. And he could use both. Ingalls had been working in comics since 1943. He started in the pulps, doing science fiction illustrations for Fiction House, and he also did some comic book features for Fiction House in their comics line. And he was very good. He could create some of the most grotesque and weird creatures and characters you ever saw. Like this fellow here, you know, this is really strange. But he just had a style that it's just incredible. A lot of people have learned a lot from studying Graham Ingalls' technique. And so he's very well known and collected in this market, and his art, no doubt, will do very, very well here at Sotheby's. Let's go on to this.
Right.
Oh, sure.
We'll walk around here and see where I'm running out of lighting problems.
Oh yeah, we're ready for this. Okay.
I'll just have to follow along there.
Yeah, I'm not that far to the left. Can't worry about that. We're recording here.
Okay. This cover here is a very interesting piece. It's cover to Crime Suspense Stories number 7, October, November, probably about 1951. That's probably late 51 or late 52. But anyway, now this cover is by an artist named Johnny Craig. Johnny Craig was very prolific in his career with EC Comics. He did a lot of covers for him, including horror covers. Well, mainly horror and crime covers was what John did. And he did it quite well. And, of course, Crime Suspense Stories feature all kinds of crazy stories that could involve, like this one, an axe murderer, or just all kinds of bizarre stories. But it was a good comic. It sold well and lasted 27 issues, I believe. And this cover is by Harvey Kurtzman, called Horror in the Night. Now, this isn't a cover. This is a story, which is actually Harvey's first story that he did for EC Comics, 1950. It was published in a comic book called The Vault of Horror. And Harvey stayed with EC for a number of years, and he went on to eventually become their their editor of Mad Comics, which, of course, later on turned into Mad Magazine. So Harvey was a humorist, and he never really liked doing the horror books or horror stories, but he did a few of them. And of course, anytime he did anything, Harvey put his best shot into it. And extremely nice work. And let's see, now this story here has to get some special attention because it's a very historical story in the history of comics. It's a story titled Foul Play. It originally appeared in The Haunt of Fear, number 19, which I think came out around 1953. It's a baseball gag story by Jack Davis, who went on to become America's top cartoonist with all kinds of things. He did TV guides, he did Time magazine, movie posters, albums, you name it. This man's done it. Well, anyway, but the thing about this story was it was a horror story, and it involved a player on this team here, which is the Bayvilles, I believe they're called. And anyway, this player was a really rotten guy. You know, he was very underhanded, and he pulled a lot of bad things on other team members and what have you. And anyway, by the end of the story, it's unbelievable. By the end of the story, they get the revenge on this fella. His name was Herbert Satin, Herbert Satin Pitcher, excuse me. Wait a minute. Okay, let's take that over again. This fellow's name was Herbert Satin, and he was a pitcher. And anyway, the gist of the story is they dismember this man, and they use his head for a baseball, a leg for a bat. The umpire is brushing off the home plate up here with a scalp. And basically they get their revenge on this fellow, and it turned out to be one of the goriest stories ever drawn for American comics. And later on, unfortunately, it got a lot of scrutiny by the public, and especially one fellow by the name of Dr. Frederic Wertham, who was a psychiatrist at a leading New York clinic. And this was one of the extreme examples that this doctor went on to cite when he wrote his book titled Seduction of the Innocent, which came out from Reinhardt Publications in 1954. And anyway, this story was definitely brought up in there, and it was a prime example of how comic publishers could get carried away with grotesquities and everything in comic books. So it certainly didn't help the history of comics. And it was shortly after this that the Comics Code Association was formed and came into being, which began to censor various comic books, and it outlawed crime and horror comics, and well, this was a major contributor to it. And here's a horror story by Al Feldstein. He was real good at these horror stories. He did them early on when EC started their new trend titles. This feature was the Crypt of Terror, and of course the host telling the story is the Crypt Keeper. And here's another Feldstein story with the Crypt Keeper. But this one here is pretty special because this is the very first Crypt of Terror story. It appeared in War Against Crime. It appeared in Crime Patrol number 15, which was right before Bill Gaines, publisher, decided to transform his pre-trend comic books into a new trend, because him and editor Al Feldstein have been discussing for some time the possibilities of starting up a horror comic book. Now, nobody had ever done this before. This was new to the comics world, and so they did it. They changed. They introduced these horror stories in the pages of Crime Patrol, and eventually changed the titles of these books to the Crypt of Terror or the Vault of Horror. And this horror host became very popular because he would introduce these stories to the readers. And usually they'd throw a little humor in there, and few gags along the way, and would come off very well. So these soon became very popular in 1949 and 1950. And we have some, speaking of Crime Patrol, we have three Crime Patrol covers here. This one here is basically considered EC's first horror cover. This was right before they changed the title into the Crypt of Terror. That followed with issue number 17. And this really is the first horror cover done for EC Comics. And it's by Johnny Craig. And the cover right below it is also by Johnny Craig. And this actually was the book, the cover for the book, which introduced the first horror story at EC. But this cover, some people debate whether or not it's really a horror cover. You know, it's more of a crime cover than anything. And that's why this issue came out right after this one, and this is really considered the first horror cover. It's got a few more elements in it that this one just doesn't have. And this one here is the cover to Crime Patrol number 13. And but these were good comics for what they were. They were crime comic books, and Al Feldstein was their editor. Bill Gaines and Al used to write a lot of the stories for EC. Bill would suggest ideas, and Al Feldstein would take those and define it into a full-fledged story. They worked together. It was a good partnership for many years. And the EC comics were unlike anything else coming out during the 1950s. You talk to people in fandom who have discovered this line of comic books, and if you talk to people who have actually read EC comic books, you will soon get their opinion and find out that these are some of the finest comics ever written, ever illustrated, ever published in the history of comic books in America. So they're very important, and they introduce trends that others followed. EC was the first to bring out horror comics. Science fiction was already around, but nobody had ever done science fiction quite like EC did it when they started those titles in 1950. And so it was one of the more respected companies that flourished during the 1950s, and their new trend ran from about 1950 to 1955, and it was one of the finest companies, and that's about all I have to say about it. Okay.